Steve Harvey secretly walks into his own restaurant, and what he discovers will shake him to his core. Most restaurant owners never truly see what happens when they're not around. They live in a bubble of ignorance, blissfully unaware of the toxic dynamics poisoning their empire from the inside. But Steve Harvey was about to pull back the curtain on a reality so devastating, so morally crushing, that it would force him to make a choice that would define not just his restaurant, but his entire legacy. This is the story of what happens when a man of principle witnesses cruelty in his own house and decides he's done being silent. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Steve Harvey decided to become a ghost in his own restaurant. He didn't call ahead. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked through the doors of his establishment like any other customer, dressed down, baseball cap pulled low, moving with the deliberate invisibility of a man who'd learned long ago that power doesn't announce itself. It whispers. The lunch rush was in full swing. Bodies moved in choreographed chaos, servers weaving between tables, the kitchen firing orders at lightning speed, the ambient noise of 100 conversations creating that perfect storm of controlled pandemonium that separates a thriving restaurant from a dying one. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The kind of perfect that made investors smile and food critics nod approvingly. The kind of perfect that filled his bank account every single month. But Steve Harvey had built an empire by reading people, by understanding what lies beneath the surface, by recognizing the difference between performance and reality. He'd spent decades on stage, interviewing thousands of people, learning to detect the microscopic shifts in tone and body language that reveal what someone is really feeling. That skill had made him a fortune in entertainment. Today, it would reveal a truth he wasn't prepared for. He chose a corner table, strategic, observational, the kind of seat a man sits in when he wants to see everything without being seen. It was the same table he'd sat at years ago when he first opened this place, dreaming about what it could become. Back then, he'd been hands-on, present, invested in every detail. Somewhere along the way, success had transformed presence into absence. Growth had meant delegation, and delegation, he was beginning to suspect, had meant blindness. A server approached with menus and water, smiled professionally, and moved on without a second glance. Good. Exactly what he wanted. The last thing he needed was recognition, conversation, the inevitable disruption that came with being Steve Harvey in public. Today, he needed to be nobody. Today, he needed to be invisible. As he settled into his seat, Steve Harvey began to truly see his restaurant for the first time in months. Not the decor, the carefully chosen artwork and ambient lighting that had cost a fortune to perfect. Not the ambiance, the subtle jazz playing through hidden speakers, the soft glow of Edison bulbs casting everything in warm, inviting tones. Not the food, though he knew it was excellent, award-winning. The kind of cuisine that justified the premium prices on the menu. He saw the people. He watched the servers move with varying degrees of confidence. Some commanded their sections with ease, their interactions with customers natural and warm, the kind of genuine hospitality that made people want to return. These servers moved through the restaurant like they belonged there, like they were proud to be there. Their smiles weren't forced. Their laughter wasn't manufactured. They were present. Others seemed to shrink into themselves, moving quickly, speaking softly, their eyes constantly scanning for approval or judgment. They moved like they were walking through a minefield, each step calculated, each interaction fraught with invisible danger. Their energy was different, depleted, cautious, afraid. He noticed the hierarchy immediately, invisible but undeniable. written in body language and spatial dynamics. There were the chosen ones, the favored servers who seemed to operate in a different realm entirely. And then there were the others, the ones who carried an invisible weight. Then he saw him, a young server, couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with an earnest face and shoulders that seemed to carry weight far beyond his years. The kid had the kind of look that suggested he genuinely cared about doing a good job. His uniform was immaculate, his movements precise, his attention to detail obvious in the way he approached each table. But there was something else there, too. Something broken. The way he moved suggested he was bracing for impact at any moment, as if kindness was something he'd learned not to expect. His name tag read Marcus, and right behind Marcus, like a shadow with malicious intent, was the manager on duty. Derek Chen. Steve Harvey knew him by reputation, efficient, driven, results-oriented. The kind of manager who kept operations running like clockwork. The kind of manager who'd impressed the previous general manager enough to recommend him for advancement. On paper, Derek was exactly the kind of leader you wanted running your restaurant when you couldn't be there yourself. But as Harvey watched, he began to see something else entirely. Something that made his stomach turn. He watched Derek's eyes follow Marcus with an intensity that went beyond supervision. It was the intensity of a predator tracking prey. He watched the way Derek's mouth would twist into a smirk when Marcus made even the smallest mistake. A fork placed on the wrong side of the plate. A water glass refilled a moment too late. A menu presented with slightly less enthusiasm than Derek apparently demanded. He watched as Derek positioned himself in Marcus's path, forcing the young server to navigate around him in ways that seemed deliberately inconvenient. Sometimes Derek would step directly into Marcus's trajectory, forcing the kid to stop abruptly or awkwardly sidestep. Other times, Derek would block access to the service station, making Marcus wait, making him pause, making him feel small. It was subtle, expertly calibrated, the kind of cruelty that exists in the margins, invisible to the casual observer, but absolutely devastating to the person experiencing it. This wasn't overt abuse. There were no raised voices, no obvious confrontations. This was something far more insidious. This was psychological warfare, dressed up as management. Steve Harvey had seen this before in his life, but never in his own establishment. Never under his own name. Never in a place that was supposed to reflect his values. Marcus dropped a water glass. A tiny accident, the kind that happens dozens of times a shift in any busy restaurant. The laws of probability dictate that in a place serving hundreds of customers daily, glasses will fall. It's not a failure. It's an inevitability. The glass shattered against the tile floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire dining room. And for a moment, the ambient noise dipped just slightly, as if everyone had unconsciously registered the sound. Derek's head snapped toward the sound like a predator catching the scent of blood. Harvey watched as Derek crossed the restaurant in measured strides, his face arranged in an expression of theatrical disappointment. He said something to Marcus. Steve couldn't hear the words from his distance, but he could read the body language with perfect clarity. Derek's finger pointed accusingly. His jaw tightened with what looked like barely contained contempt. Marcus's face flushed crimson, a deep red that spread from his neck upward, and his eyes dropped to the floor with the defeated posture of someone who'd learned that looking at his tormentor only made things worse. Around them, other servers pretended not to notice. They suddenly became very focused on their tables, very engaged with their customers, very intent on being anywhere but present in that moment. Customers remained oblivious, lost in their own conversations and meals, unaware that something toxic was unfolding mere feet away. The machine kept running. The restaurant continued its choreographed dance. But something had shifted in the energy, and Steve Harvey saw it, every moment of it, every calculated humiliation, every microaggression designed to chip away at a young man's confidence and dignity. He saw the way Derek's words seemed to land like physical blows. He saw the way Marcus's shoulders collapsed inward, making himself smaller, trying to disappear. He saw the way Derek turned away with a satisfied expression, having accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. To diminish, to demean, to dominate. In that moment, sitting alone in his corner booth, Steve Harvey realized something that made his chest tighten with a mixture of shame and resolve. His restaurant had become a kingdom of cruelty, and he'd been too absent to stop it. Worse, he'd created the conditions that allowed it to flourish. By stepping back, by trusting others to maintain his vision, by prioritizing profit over presence, he'd inadvertently built a machine that chewed up young people like Marcus and spat them out broken. He ordered his food slowly, methodically, a salmon entree, a side salad, water with lemon. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. And as he waited for his meal, he continued watching. Always watching, observing the patterns, understanding the dynamics, recognizing the depth of the problem. This wasn't just about one manager and one server. This was systemic. This was cultural. This was what happened when leadership abdicated responsibility in the name of growth and success. And Steve Harvey knew, with absolute certainty, that he could no longer be complicit in his own absence. But what he was about to see would shatter everything he thought he knew about the place bearing his name. The food arrived 20 minutes later, and Steve Harvey used the time to deepen his observations. He watched Marcus work his section with a kind of desperate grace. The kid was genuinely talented. His timing was impeccable. His attention to detail was exceptional. His ability to anticipate customer needs before they were voiced suggested someone with real instinct for hospitality. Under different circumstances, Marcus would be the kind of server that restaurants competed for, the kind of employee that made a dining experience memorable. But those talents were being weaponized against him, turned into evidence of his failure rather than markers of his success. Every time Marcus excelled, Derek seemed to find something wrong. A table wasn't cleared fast enough. The presentation of a plate wasn't perfect enough. The tone of voice when greeting a customer wasn't warm enough. It was a masterclass in moving goalposts, in creating an impossible standard that shifted the moment it was approached. Steve watched as Derek called Marcus over to the host stand, a public location, visible to other staff, visible to customers. Derek's voice was low, controlled, the kind of tone that suggested he was being reasonable and professional. But his words were surgical in their precision. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," Derek said, his face arranged in an expression of false concern. "Your performance today has been inconsistent. Table 12 waited 7 minutes for their water refill. Table 15's entrees came out before their appetizers were cleared. These are basic things, Marcus. Basic things that a server at this level should understand instinctively." Steve could see Marcus's jaw clench. The kid knew, everyone in the restaurant knew, that Derek was lying. Table 12 had received water promptly. Table 15's timing had been perfect. But the specificity of the false accusations gave them weight. They sounded credible. They sounded like legitimate criticism from a manager doing his job. "I apologize," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do better." "I'm sure you will," Derek replied, his tone suggesting he believed the exact opposite. "Because if you don't, we're going to have a serious conversation about whether you're really cut out for this position." It was a threat dressed up as management, a promise of consequences disguised as concern. Marcus nodded and turned away, and Steve Harvey caught the exact moment when the kid's face crumpled, just for a fraction of a second, just enough for someone paying attention to see the pain. Then Marcus composed himself, straightened his uniform, and returned to work. This was the pattern, Steve realized. This was how Derek operated. He'd watched Derek do this 3 times now in the span of 40 minutes. 3 different servers, 3 different manufactured crises, 3 different moments of public humiliation designed to establish dominance and control. Derek Chen was a bully, not the crude, obvious kind that threw things or raised his voice. Derek was far more sophisticated than that. Derek was a strategic bully, someone who'd learned that the most effective way to control people was to make them doubt themselves, to keep them perpetually off balance, to establish a dynamic where they were constantly trying to prove their worth to someone who'd already decided they were worthless. And the worst part? The system enabled it. The restaurant's hierarchical structure, the power dynamic between manager and server. The fact that Derek controlled schedules and shifts and opportunities for advancement. All of it created a context where his behavior wasn't just tolerated. It was institutionalized. Steve Harvey had built this machine. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the simple act of stepping away. By trusting others to maintain his vision, by prioritizing growth over culture, by assuming that good systems would naturally produce good people. He was wrong. The afternoon wore on, and Steve continued to observe. He watched as Derek found reasons to criticize other servers, always in that same measured tone, always with those same surgical precision accusations. He watched as the energy in the restaurant shifted, the staff becoming increasingly tense, increasingly cautious, increasingly focused on avoiding Derek's attention rather than on actually serving customers well. Paradoxically, the restaurant was still operating smoothly. The food was still excellent. The customers were still being served adequately. But the spirit of the place had been poisoned. What should have been a place of hospitality and genuine human connection had become a place of fear and performance. Steve watched a server named Jennifer, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been doing this for a long time, literally flinch when Derek walked past her table. Not because he'd said anything, not because he'd done anything overt, just because of his presence. His mere proximity had become a source of anxiety. This was what unchecked power did to people. This was what happened when someone with authority decided to weaponize it. And Marcus, poor Marcus, seemed to be Derek's primary target. Steve watched as Derek found excuses to interact with him constantly. A correction here, a criticism there, a subtle comment about his appearance, his pace, his attitude. It was relentless. It was calculated. It was designed to break someone down, piece by piece. By the time the lunch service was winding down, Marcus looked hollowed out. His movements had become mechanical. His eyes had lost their initial spark. He was still performing his job adequately, but something essential had been drained from him. Steve Harvey finished his meal slowly, methodically, while internally preparing for what he knew was coming. Because this couldn't continue. Not in his restaurant, not under his name, not while he had the power to stop it. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of the problem. He needed to see how deep this went, He needed to understand whether Derek was a symptom of a larger cultural issue or whether he was an isolated cancer that could be removed. As the lunch rush transitioned into the quieter afternoon hours, Steve made a decision. He would stay. He would order coffee. He would watch the staff as they transitioned from service mode to cleaning and prep mode. He would observe how Derek behaved when the customers were gone, when there was no need to maintain appearances. What he discovered would be even worse than what he'd already seen. But Marcus was about to face something far worse than anything he'd experienced before. The lunch service ended at 2:47 p.m., marked by the last customer paying their bill and the front-of-house staff beginning their transition into closing procedures. Steve Harvey remained in his corner booth, nursing a cold cup of coffee, his presence so unremarkable that he'd become invisible to the staff, exactly as he'd intended. What happened next revealed the true nature of Derek Chen's character. With the customers gone, Derek's demeanor shifted. The carefully constructed veneer of professionalism fell away, replaced by something raw, more authentic, and infinitely more disturbing. He moved through the restaurant like a general surveying conquered territory, his eyes sharp, his movements deliberate, his entire posture radiating a kind of predatory satisfaction. Steve watched as Derek gathered the staff in the dining room. A post-service meeting, ostensibly to discuss the day's performance and prepare for the evening shift. These meetings were supposed to be motivational, constructive, a time for feedback and team building. What Steve witnessed was something entirely different. "All right, listen up," Derek announced, his voice carrying across the empty restaurant. The staff assembled in a loose semicircle, their body language already defensive, already braced for impact. Today's service was subpar, not terrible, but subpar, and I need to know why. He paused, letting the weight of that accusation settle over the group. Steve could see the staff exchanging glances, each person silently wondering if they were about to be publicly criticized. "We had several issues," Derek continued, pacing slowly like a prosecutor building a case. "Timing was off, attention to detail was lacking, and most importantly, I felt a lack of commitment from several members of this team." He stopped his pacing and looked directly at Marcus. "Marcus, come here," he said, his tone casual, as if he was about to ask an innocent question. Marcus stepped forward, his face already flushed, already anticipating what was coming. Steve could see the kid's hands trembling slightly. Whether from anger or fear, it was difficult to tell. "You know what your problem is?" Derek asked, not waiting for an answer. "You come in here, you do the bare minimum, and you expect that to be enough. You expect me to be satisfied with mediocrity. You expect this restaurant to celebrate you for doing what you're literally being paid to do. That's not fair," Marcus said quietly, his voice shaking. "I've been working hard. You've been working hard?" Derek interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of mockery. "Marcus, I've seen you work hard. And this isn't it. This is you phoning it in. This is you not caring enough to actually be excellent." Steve Harvey felt something shift in his chest. A tightening, a hardening, a clarity that comes from witnessing injustice in its rawest form. "You know what the real problem is?" Derek continued. And now his voice had taken on a tone that was almost conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "You're not cut out for this. You're not built for the kind of excellence we demand here. Some people have it. Some people have that drive, that hunger, that need to be great. And some people..." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Some people are just okay, and okay isn't good enough. Marcus's face had gone pale. Steve could see the kid's eyes glistening, could see him fighting to maintain composure in front of his peers. Around them, the other staff members had become very still, very quiet, very focused on appearing invisible. "I think," Derek said, his voice dropping to a tone of false sympathy, "we need to have a serious conversation about your future here, because right now, I'm not convinced you have one." And there it was, the nuclear option, the threat that would haunt Marcus for weeks, that would undermine his confidence, that would make him question whether he should even bother trying anymore. Marcus stood there, frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly that Steve could see the muscles working beneath his skin. For a moment, Steve thought the kid might explode, might finally stand up to Derek, might finally say something in his own defense. But he didn't. Instead, Marcus nodded slowly, turned away, and walked toward the back of the restaurant. And Steve Harvey saw something break inside that young man. Not visibly, not dramatically, but it was there. A light going out, a hope extinguishing, a spirit being systematically dismantled. Derek turned his attention to the rest of the staff. "This goes for all of you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of threat. "Excellence isn't optional. It's not negotiable. It's the baseline. And if you can't meet that baseline, then you need to ask yourself whether you really belong here." The meeting continued for another 10 minutes, but Steve barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere, processing what he'd just witnessed, understanding the full scope of what had happened in his absence. Derek Chen wasn't just a bad manager. He was a predator who'd found a system that allowed him to prey on vulnerable people. Young servers trying to make a living, trying to build a career, trying to prove their worth. And he'd weaponized his position of authority to systematically break them down. The staff dispersed slowly, each person moving with the heaviness of people who'd just been psychologically battered. Marcus didn't reappear. Steve assumed he'd gone to the back, probably to the staff bathroom, probably to have the kind of breakdown that you can only have in private. Steve Harvey sat in his corner booth, his coffee long since gone cold, and made a decision. Derek Chen would be gone by the end of the day. But first, Steve needed to understand something. He needed to know if this was Derek's isolated pathology or if it was a symptom of a larger cultural problem. He needed to know how many other people had been damaged by this man's presence. He needed to know the full extent of the wound before he could begin to heal it. He pulled out his phone and made a call to his general manager, Patricia, a woman he trusted, a woman who'd been with the restaurant since its opening. "Patricia, it's Steve," he said quietly. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it discreetly." "Of course," Patricia replied immediately. "What do you need?" "I need you to pull the personnel files for everyone who's worked with Derek Chen in the past 18 months. I need to know how many people have quit, been fired, or transferred. I need to know the reasons they gave. And I need this information by the end of the day." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Steve, what's going on?" Patricia asked, concern evident in her voice. "Just do it," Steve said. "And Patricia, don't mention this to Derek, not a word." He hung up the phone and sat back in his booth, watching as the restaurant transitioned into its pre-dinner preparations. The staff moved with the kind of cautious efficiency that suggested they were all still processing Derek's words, still bracing for the next round of criticism, still operating under the weight of his psychological presence. This was his restaurant. These were his values. And somehow, in his absence, those values had been corrupted by someone who understood that power, when unchecked, could be weaponized into something truly destructive. Steve Harvey had built an empire on reading people. on understanding human nature, on recognizing what made people tick. And he'd failed to see what was happening in his own house. That was about to change. But the truth Patricia uncovered would be far darker than anything Steve had witnessed so far. Steve Harvey left the restaurant at 4:15 p.m., driving through the October afternoon with his mind churning. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove to his office, a sleek, minimalist space in a downtown high-rise that overlooked the city. This was where he did his real work, where he made the decisions that affected thousands of people across his various enterprises. He sat at his desk and waited. Patricia called at 5:47 p.m., her voice tight with concern. "Steve, I've pulled the files," she said without preamble. "I need to talk to you about this in person. It's worse than you might think." 30 minutes later, Patricia sat across from him in his office, a stack of personnel files spread across his desk, like evidence at a crime scene. Her face was pale, her expression troubled, the look of someone who just discovered something deeply wrong in a place they thought they knew. "In the 18 months that Derek has been managing," Patricia began, her voice steady but heavy, "we've had 12 servers leave. 12. Do you understand what that means? That's a turnover rate of nearly 60% in that department alone." Steve listened, saying nothing, letting her continue. "Of those 12, 3 cited personal reasons in their exit interviews. But when I dug deeper, when I actually talked to them off the record, they all said the same thing. Derek made them feel worthless. One of them, a girl named Sarah, she told me she'd started having panic attacks before her shifts. Actual panic attacks. She was a good server, Steve. She had positive customer feedback. But she couldn't handle working under Derek anymore." Patricia pulled out a folder. "Then there are the others. 4 servers transferred to other locations. All of them requested transfers specifically to get away from Derek. 2 were fired, officially for performance issues. But when I reviewed their files, their performance metrics were actually average or above average. The only real issue was that Derek had documented them extensively, creating a paper trail that made it look like they were failing." Steve felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And then," Patricia continued, her voice dropping, "there's Marcus." She pulled out a thick file. "Marcus has been with us for 8 months. His customer feedback is consistently excellent. His sales numbers are strong. He's punctual, reliable, and genuinely cares about doing a good job. But Derek has documented him extensively. Performance issues, attitude problems, inconsistency. It's all there in the file, Steve. A clear record of failure." "But I watched him today," Steve said quietly. "He's not failing. He's being sabotaged." Patricia nodded grimly. "I know. I've been watching too. And I've been trying to figure out why Derek is doing this. So I did some digging into Derek's background." She pulled out another file. "Derek Chen came to us from a restaurant group in Chicago. When I called his previous employer, they were very careful about what they said. You know, legal liability and all that. But between the lines, I got the impression that Derek had left under somewhat contentious circumstances. There were hints of complaints from staff, but nothing formal enough to create a legal issue. So we hired someone with a documented history of staff problems," Steve said, the realization settling over him like a weight. "We hired someone because he had excellent operational metrics," Patricia corrected gently. "His restaurants ran smoothly. His food costs were low. His labor costs were optimized. On paper, he looked like exactly the kind of manager you wanted running a high-volume operation. And in reality, In reality, Patricia said, he's a predator who's learned how to hide his predation behind operational excellence. Steve stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere down there, Marcus was probably at home, probably replaying Derek's words over and over, probably questioning whether he had what it took to succeed in this industry. I want him gone, Steve said flatly. Today. Now. I don't care about the legal implications. I don't care about severance packages or 2 weeks' notice. Derek Chen is no longer employed by this restaurant as of this moment. Steve, Patricia began. I'm serious, he interrupted. And I want you to do something else. I want you to personally reach out to everyone who left under Derek's management. I want to know if any of them would be willing to come back. I want to know what we need to do to make this right. Patricia nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was saying. What about the documentation? The files Derek created? They're going to make it difficult to defend if any of this becomes legal. Destroy them, Steve said. All of it. Anything Derek documented about performance issues goes in the trash. We're starting fresh. Clean slate for anyone who worked under him. That's a significant liability. I don't care, Steve said, turning back from the window. Patricia, I built this restaurant on the principle that we treat people with dignity and respect. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I stepped away, and I let someone like Derek turn my values upside down. That ends today. He sat back down at his desk and pulled out his phone. Get Derek on the phone. Tell him I need to see him in my office in 30 minutes. Don't tell him why. Don't give him any warning. Patricia left to make the call, and Steve sat alone with his thoughts. He thought about Marcus, a kid who'd come to this industry with hope and enthusiasm, only to have it systematically beaten out of him by someone who'd weaponized authority into a tool of psychological destruction. He thought about Sarah, the server who'd developed panic attacks. He thought about Jennifer, whose flinch had revealed the depth of the fear that Derek had instilled. He thought about all the invisible ways that unchecked power could corrupt a space, could poison a culture, could turn a place that was supposed to be about hospitality and human connection into something toxic and degrading. And he thought about his own complicity. He'd created the conditions that allowed this to happen. He'd stepped away. He'd trusted someone he shouldn't have trusted. He'd prioritized growth and profit over presence and people. That was about to change. 30 minutes later, Derek Chen walked into Steve Harvey's office. Derek looked confident, almost smug. He probably thought this was a commendation meeting, a recognition of his operational excellence. He probably thought he was about to be praised for running a tight ship. He was about to learn otherwise. Derek, sit down, Steve said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Derek sat, his expression shifting slightly, sensing that something was off. I spent the afternoon in my restaurant, Steve continued. I watched you work. I watched how you interacted with your staff. And I came to a very clear conclusion. He paused, letting the tension build. You're done here. Effective immediately. You're no longer employed by this restaurant, this company, or any entity associated with me. Security will escort you out. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, which is more than you deserve. And if you ever work in this industry again, it will be because I choose not to share what I know about your management style with other restaurant owners. Derek's face went pale. Steve, Don't, Steve interrupted. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't tell me about your operational metrics or your food costs or any of the other data points that you've used to hide what you really are. I know exactly what you are. You're a bully who's learned how to bully people in ways that are hard to document and easy to deny. You're someone who gets off on power and dominance. And you're someone who has no place in any organization that claims to value human dignity. Derek started to stand. You can't just... I can, Steve said coldly. And I am. Security is waiting outside. You have 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings from the manager's office. After that, you're being escorted from the building. Derek left, his face a mixture of shock and rage. Steve sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him, but also feeling something else. Clarity. Rightness. The sense of having corrected something that had been fundamentally wrong. Patricia appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. It's done. Security is walking him out now. Good, Steve said. Now, I need you to do something else. I need you to call an all-hands meeting for tomorrow morning before the restaurant opens. Every staff member, every shift, everyone. I need to address them. What are you going to say? Patricia asked. Steve looked out the window again, at the city below, at the thousands of people trying to make their way through the world with dignity and hope. The truth, he said simply. I'm going to tell them the truth about what happened, why it happened, and what's going to change. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my time rebuilding what I allowed to be broken. But rebuilding would prove far more complicated than Steve had anticipated, and the damage ran deeper than anyone realized.